Have you ever wondered why you make quote unquote stupid mistakes? Or why you can't form a coherent thought in a stressful meeting? This week, I talk with Caroline Brewin, executive and leadership coach and founder of Brain Powered Coaching. Here, she shares what happens to our brains under pressure and why we struggle with so much self doubt. These insights can help us to feel less alone while recognizing that we're not defective, we're just stressed. We also talk about the risks to organizations when critical masses of employees experience stress and self doubt. Thank you so much, as always, for listening. Welcome to the Impostor Syndrome Files. My name is Kim Meninger, and as an executive coach and former high-tech leader, my personal mission is to help professionals overcome imposter syndrome so that you can advance your career with confidence. Each week, I interview a new guest who brings a powerful perspective to this conversation, including personal stories, best practices, and new insights. The more we talk about this issue, the more we destigmatize imposter syndrome, recognize that we're not alone, and empower ourselves to access the tools and resources that can help us and those around us. Thank you so much for listening and for sharing with others you think would benefit from this conversation. Welcome, Caroline. It is so wonderful to have you here today, and I would love to start our conversation by inviting you to introduce yourself.
Thank you, Kim. Thank you very much for having me. It's a pleasure to be here. So my name is Caroline Brewin. I am from the UK. I've lived in Australia, Singapore, and back in the UK. I've been all over the years. And I started my journey in investment banking and spent 18 years in that world. And, 18 years ago, it was a very male-driven world, primarily. And I guess certainly the title of this podcast and where my passion really is around helping people, particularly women, with confidence. And the reason why is because having spent all that time in such a tough environment, what I found was so many people really struggled with things, and it came up as, maybe they're not ready for promotion, maybe they don't have gravitas. It was the way that people described these kind of things were very much high level. But what I found, having trained as a professional coach alongside my banking career, when I started coaching, and I'm sure you found this in yours as well, so much of what people struggled with was about confidence. Mm-hmm. And so after 18 years of investment banking, I basically decided to escape, and I started my own business, Brain Powered Coaching. And we focus primarily on the neuroscience of confidence. So I trained from an applied neuroscience perspective, looking at the brain and behavior and how the two of them are linked. And then how you can, when you understand those levers, how that can fundamentally help you shift how you behave, how you perform, whether that's individually or within an organization.
So that is fascinating to me. And I know this is a very big topic, so we could probably spend days discussing it. But yeah. Can you share whatever you think is sort of the entry level description of what we should know about the brain as it relates to confidence? Like when we think about confidence, especially if you haven't been trained in neuroscience, right? That might not be the first thought, but how did you make that connection? And what do you think about when it comes to the human brain's relationship to confidence?
Well, let me tell you a story, because I think that really, it was the biggest light bulb that I had. So, when I worked in banking, I really struggled with imposter syndrome. It was something that when I first started, I told them I didn't know anything about banking. I genuinely knew nothing about it. But over the time, I learned a little bit. But I always felt that I should have known more. And I was surrounded by lots of people who are very technically based. And so imposter syndrome, that feeling of being a fraud, was there kind of on my shoulder so much of the time. And it really showed up when I was moving into a role, which was the biggest role that I'd had it was the chief of staff for the ops and tech area, which was 25,000 people. And so it was a big role, really exciting. It was focused on, people and strategy and management support. But when I started, I didn't know what I was doing at all. And I had that feeling of, oh my goodness, I don't know what I'm doing. Why have they hired me? They're going to find out that I'm a fraud. And what happened was I actually started making really stupid mistakes. And it was like I was frozen. And things like, putting the wrong date on an email that I checked 20 times. My boss had said, take out one of the slides, make sure you take out slide 23. It's confidential. I left it in, even though I thought I must do this. And I had so many of these things, which is like, I was kind of classed as a high performer. And yet I was making really stupid mistakes. And then I learned about the brain and what happens when you're under pressure. And basically, and if you understand this principle, it makes sense of so much of life. And that is that your brain can only function on a certain amount of energy. It's about 25 watts of energy, so a bit like a light bulb. And it will use 25 watts of energy in whatever way it feels is the most appropriate. So it will prioritize that. It can't power up to 40 watts because it will fry like an egg. So it just has that 25 watts. So if you are under stress, your brain doesn't use the prefrontal cortex so much. So that's the thinking part of your brain. That's what they call it, the executive functioning piece. It developed much later in our evolutionary process. What it does is it uses that energy towards the back of the brain, which is where we have our survival mechanism. And so that's the bit which is ready for powering us up for fight, flight, freeze, those threat responses that we're probably quite familiar with. And so when you're under stress, when you're under high pressure, like I was in that role, your creative thought, your problem solving, your executive functioning isn't working. And that's why you make stupid mistakes. That's why you can't think clearly at the time when someone asks you a stupid question, a tough question. You just think, oh, and you freeze. That's why when you have an argument with someone, it's only afterwards you think of that brilliant thing. You think, oh, I should have said this. But it's your brain being really clever. It's an adaptive response. It's saying, I don't need to be thinking of an executive functioning piece right now. I just need to survive. And for me, I was just like, oh my goodness, I wish I'd understood this. Because had I known that, I would have given myself so much more grace in situations where I thought I wasn't good enough. I was being stupid. How could I be so ridiculous that I would forget the answer to that? And then I would have been able to actually use tools and levers to be able to fix that as well. So that for me is that there's different pieces of it which come off that, but when you understand that, it's such a central point to understanding how your brain operates in stress and things like imposter syndrome.
I love the way you shared that. And I think that is such an important principle. And I think about this a lot because it has implications for the narrative we hold about ourselves, right? Because to your point, if I'm in a meeting and I suddenly lose my ability to articulate what I want to say, and I'm surrounded by all of these people that I perceive to be smarter than I am, I'm going to walk out of that room thinking, see, I knew I didn't belong in this room, right? I couldn't even say something intelligent in that moment, when in reality, it's because of exactly what you just said. And the reason why the people around us aren't necessarily showing up that way is because that's not a triggering moment for them. They're triggered by different things, right? And I think that's a really important part of this as well, is that we all show up this way, but we all respond to different forces and different moments. Yeah. So, if we're thinking to ourselves, just like you said, I can't believe I made this stupid mistake. It must be me. It must be something wrong with me. Other people are going to make stupid mistakes in different contexts, right?
Yeah, absolutely. And the thing is that we are we're so hyper vigilant about ourselves in a way that other people just aren't. So something that we walk away from a meeting thinking, oh my goodness, they're all going to think I'm such an idiot, and we judge and, repeat. And the truth is, you ask someone an hour later and they're like, oh, I didn't even notice that, because they were thinking about their next question, or, the senior leader, what they were asking, or what they were having for lunch, or the argument they had earlier that day. Right. So, yeah, so we're so tough on ourselves.
Exactly. And I think that is funny. I was actually just having this conversation with my 14-year-old son a couple of days ago, too, just trying to let him know as early as possible that nobody thinks about us as much as we think they do. And that those nights that we spend worrying about, oh my gosh,
Yeah.
what must people think? They're not. As you said, they're thinking about their own stuff. They're not paying attention in the way we think they
Yeah.
are.
Yeah, absolutely. And there's such tremendous freedom when you can just say, okay, well, never mind, the judgment doesn't matter, and therefore I have control, or I can influence as much as possible how much I'm going to judge myself.
Yeah. And I mean, there are probably people listening who are thinking, yeah, but what if it's a really big mistake or, something that people do notice? Because there are
Mhm.
times when maybe your manager gets mad or your mistake has an impact. But I think there's a difference there, and that becomes an opportunity for learning and to be
Yep.
able to look at it instead as it's not a catastrophic failure most of the time, right? It's more of a, okay, what can I do differently next time to make sure that this doesn't happen again, right?
Yeah.
And so we can
Yeah.
take the lesson from it, we can process
Mhm.
it productively, but if we're ruminating about it for
Yeah.
weeks, then it's no longer, it's no longer,
Yeah, it's not helpful. It's not
yeah.
helpful. Well, and the interesting thing is, there's something so simple, really simple tool that you can use when you're in those situations. And I guess for me, it was always, oh my goodness, what happens? I ran the client relationship management team. What happens if I go to a client and they ask me a question about something and I don't know the answer? And because that was playing into my, maybe I'm not good enough from a technical perspective in terms of my finance knowledge. And when I was thinking about it when I was actually going for an interview for getting promoted, and I was talking to my coach, and I was in tears. I was in floods of tears, just going, "Oh, I'm so frightened. What happens? What happens if they ask me a question?" And she said, "Caroline, what are your values?" And I said, honesty, integrity, respect, amongst a few others. And she said, okay, so what if you're in a situation where you don't know the answer? Don't lie about it, tap into your values. And so, instead of making something up, you just say, I don't have the answer to that right now, but let me check and get back to you. And no one's going to say, what? I mean, if you say that to every single question, people might slightly kind of look a little perplexed. But the vast majority of the times, people would much prefer for you to say, let me check and get back to you, rather than make something up, because everyone always can tell when you do.
Yes, I love that strategy. I love that specific strategy, but I love the broader strategy that you're saying too, which is tapping into your values, because I think about that a lot. We don't have proven systems for how to navigate our lives, right? There's no manual, there's no blueprint. And even if there were, your manual would have to be different from mine because
Yeah.
we have different values and different interests. And,
Mm,
and so that is one of the things that I often say to people too is pause, right? Because we're so reactive and we're rushing through these situations, is pause long enough to ask yourself, how do I want to show up in this moment, right? Who do I want to be right now? What do I
mm,
value most? What do I want to prioritize? And to your point, that honesty, that integrity that comes with saying, I don't know, first of all, you're going to show up much more confidently after that, too. You're not going to regret, you're not going to be,
yeah.
second guessing yourself, worrying, oh no, everyone's going to find out I was making it up.
Yeah.
But
Yeah.
but also, yeah, you can be proud of the fact that you stood firm in what you stand for. And I think we're always second guessing ourselves, but when we come from a place of our values, we're much less likely to experience that regret and shame after the fact.
Yeah, absolutely. And we actually did some research of 17,000 people. We've got over 17,000 now. And we found that 90% of people said that they doubt themselves and second guess their decisions.
Mm-hmm.
So, I mean, if you look around the table, nearly everyone else is second guessing themselves, which is kind of reassuring, I think, from an individual perspective. And from an organizational point of view, oh my goodness, like that's a whole lot of people who potentially aren't bringing their thoughts, their ideas, their brilliance, their challenges to the table because they're thinking, is this going to be the right thing?
Yes, you're absolutely right. And they're potentially making stupid mistakes, right? That are wasting time and, might have an impact on the business. So I think, obviously no one's human. I mean, no, we're all human. No one's perfect. The idea that, certain cultures that are perhaps a little bit more aggressive in nature or a little bit more toxic in nature,
Yeah.
right, are actually fueling this and creating a more hostile environment for people's brains to operate in, right?
Yeah.
It's something we should be paying more attention to because, those kinds of systems might think that they're doing something right for their business, but they're actually not compatible with how the human brain operates.
Absolutely. And this is what, if we come back to that original principle that we talked about at the beginning, your brain is operating on that 25 watts of energy. If it feels it is under threat, and that is, always influenced by the environment it's in, it will be operating in that state of threat, just like I was feeling like I didn't know what I was doing. And actually, that is the people, that's the manager, the leadership team, the colleagues around them. And this is where this concept of psychological safety comes in, which is all around, is it safe to show up and be me? And can I be myself in this environment? And it's about that brain's energy, because if you feel safe to be yourself, what you're going to get is much more creative thought, because you're using your prefrontal cortex, much more problem solving, really strategic ideas versus being very shut down. And the more people feel under threat, the more their focus will narrow onto very much themselves, and very short-term thinking as well. Am I going to be safe? Is he going to stab me in the back? When's my, am I going to have a job? And so from an organizational perspective, it completely locks it up. And there was a really interesting piece by a guy called Sean Aker. He wrote a book called The Happiness Advantage, which is it's a little bit old now, but it's unbelievable. It's such a great book. And they did some research and they found that the brain at positive is 31% more productive than at negative, neutral, or stressed. Like 30%. Can you imagine if organizations can harness that? And I think that's what people don't understand. They kind of go, oh, well, it's a nice organization to work for. People seem quite motivated. And it's like, yeah, but do you know why? Do you know what the difference is in terms of that performance? It's because their brains can go, okay, let's create something wonderful.
And it's so interesting when you think about people who will dismiss the conversation because they feel like, oh, that's fluff, right?
Yeah.
That's not quantitative. That's not, not the most important thing to think about when it comes to the business.
Yeah.
But
Yeah.
if you are, when you're thinking about driving a car, you want to know about the engine, right?
Exactly.
And we just dismiss the human side as
Yeah.
being less significant or just
Lucky.
afterthought, right? Yeah.
Mm. Well, this is where I think that's where the work that I do, I think, has been interesting to corporates, because so often I think a lot of where we've focused is, it feels like, the soft skills we used to call them, right? But when you can create a bridge between, okay, well, the soft skills, but what's the neuroscience impact of that? And what's the actual reason why? What's the underlying reason why? that bridge actually helps people, particularly those very analytical corporates, go, that's the data.
Mhm.
And when you give them the data, they can say, okay, now we'll get it. That's what we'll invest in, because we understand really that there is value in it. And that's the why.
So are you seeing that more often? Are you seeing organizations being open to these conversations? Like, obviously there is a spectrum out there, but are there any
Mm.
shifts that you're noticing in willingness to discuss these types of topics?
Mm. Um, yeah, I mean, I think what's very interesting is when I talk to people around, often my intro discussion will be with someone from a business perspective who's interested in just the high level neuroscience of confidence. Um, what we then do often is bring in the kind of HR teams, learning and development teams, and sometimes they say, "Oh, we've already got this," and invariably they definitely do not, because neuroscience is really very much it's very, very early really in terms of how that's integrated into existing programs, and so people absolutely, when they start to get a little bit of a flavor of this, go, oh my goodness, wow. And as a result of some of the work we've done, we've seen a 30% increase in confidence levels, 30% reduction in stress, um, 25% improvement in happiness and positivity levels. And this isn't like we were saying, yay, aren't we all happy and positive? It's like, no, you're going to get a 30% increase in your performance.
Mm.
So let's talk about this from an ROI perspective. And, there's real business interest in that.
Yeah, absolutely. And what are there other things that you could share with us about what individuals can do to start to move in that direction?
Mm. Yeah, I mean, I think one of the other core principles from your brain's perspective, and why imposter syndrome in particular comes up, is that your brain is terrified of being excluded. It wants to be part of a tribe. You would know this very well. Um, and if I bring this back to something which I'm sure we've all experienced, um, when you're at school and you're younger and people are picking teams for sports, and someone's at the front and picking out people, and other people are going and high-fiving each other as they go over, and you're just getting more and more feeling of dread as you're like, I'm going to be the last one. Right? I mean, I don't know if they still do that. I really hope not, because it's the worst situation. And so what they've actually found is that the areas of the brain associated with social pain, so that social pain of being excluded, are actually overlap with the areas associated with physical pain. So it can be very painful for us to feel excluded. And so our brain really wants to be part of a tribe. If you take it back to caveman days, that's when we needed to be part of a tribe to survive. From the woolly mammoths or tigers or whatever that danger was, if we were migrating, you needed to be together. And so from that perspective, when you understand around from a imposter syndrome point of view, why it may come up is that there may be a level of hypervigilance that we could have about our social standing. And so that hypervigilance is actually an adaptive strategy. So the hypervigilance is like, don't leave me, I don't want to be someone who is excluded. And therefore, it's really, imposter syndrome is something like, I don't want to be excluded. And how can I make sure that I'm not? It's a big red flag for us. So with that in mind, understanding actually, so from our research, what we found was 52% of people experience imposter syndrome daily or regularly. So when you look around the room and you think, I'm the only one, half of the people, men and women, so really interesting, we got the gender stats for that as well. Men and women were actually the same. 52% of them experienced imposter syndrome very regularly. So it's not only you. It's something which is really, really normal. Um, and even Einstein experienced imposter syndrome. And he said, the exaggerated esteem in which my life work is held makes me feel very ill at ease. I feel compelled to think of myself as an involuntary swindler.
I love that quote. I think that's such an important one to put into
Isn't
perspective,
it?
right? That we are certainly far from alone. And, people, you would assume somebody like an Albert Einstein would be the last person to struggle with self.
Right? Exactly. And so it's really, really normal. So in terms of, things for people which are really important for them to know is like stop making false comparisons.
Mm.
You're comparing yourself to people when you don't have any of the data around them. Their starting point is different, their struggles are different. If you're looking at yourself them on social media, we know, there's the shiny bit and there's a whole lot going on underneath that. And we've got to let go of this idea that everyone else is on a pedestal and, we're somewhere down the bottom struggling. Because you know what, everyone's doing the best they can, but everyone's struggling too.
Yeah, I think that's such an important point too around the different starting points because I think a lot of our experience with confidence in the workplace seems to me to carry over from our experience in school. And when we're in school, we're part of a cohort that goes linearly through an
Yeah,
education
yeah.
process. And so
Yeah,
when
I
we
know.
get into the class for the first time, we are kind of all at the same level. We're learning at the same,
Yeah,
right? We may have different skills and capabilities, but generally speaking, there aren't people in the room who have a lot more information or experience than we have. And
yeah,
then we go into the workplace and we sort of bring those same expectations that I should be at the same level as everyone around me. And it's not the same paradigm, right? And I think it's
yeah.
really important too to remind ourselves of that is that there are going to be people who are years ahead of us. There are going to be people who are not as experienced as we are. And so we have to
Mm,
shift the way we think about that.
mm. And everyone is bringing their own gifts to the table. So I was invited to speak at a whole group about the neuroscience of confidence. That's my kind of area. But they were all neuroscience coaches. Some of them much more experienced than I was, and I was terrified. Thinking, oh my goodness, they're going to judge me so much. And then someone said, Caroline, you're bringing your perspective of this. You've had all of the experience from your corporate point of view and your training, and you're bringing all of that together in your way. Own your space where you've come from and don't judge it by everyone else's. And this is the thing, I think if people can lean back into that, this is where I've come from, and I'm bringing all sorts of stuff to the table, which, yes, absolutely are different to everyone else, which is great. Awesome. How can we come to the best possible outcome together?
That's right.
Because that's diversity of thought. And that's where you get the best possible solutions.
You're absolutely right. And I think too that a lot of our thinking is coming from a place of believing that there's one right answer, that there's
Yeah.
one right way to do something. And you
Mm,
mentioned before creativity and innovation, and we're often coming into problems that either haven't been solved before or that we're looking for new ways to address. And so if you're looking for the one proven way to do something, you're not accessing your own creativity. You're not bringing those unique gifts to the table.
exactly. And to your point earlier, even if you don't necessarily you make a point and it isn't like everyone goes, oh, fantastic point, Kim. What you are actually doing is what you might do is stimulate a thought. No, that's not quite right. But, maybe, and you've opened up a different door for something else.
Mhm.
Um, so trusting that journey together is something you're going to take a few wrong turns, but you're contributing towards that being the best possible decision in the end.
Yes. And I think too, when it comes back to values, I often think about it as we have these conflicts in those moments where there's a value around staying safe and not exposing ourselves to that kind of fear that you're describing of being excluded, being rejected in some way. And then there's a value around challenging ourselves and contributing and making an impact.
Mm.
Most of the people I know, are high achievers. They want to make an impact, but they're playing small because they're afraid. And so to ask yourself too, which value do I want to honor in this moment? Because yeah, I'm guaranteed to stay quote unquote safe if I don't contribute to this conversation. But just as you're
Yeah.
saying, I'm also not going to influence it in any meaningful way if I sit it out.
Well, I mean, you're guaranteed failure, right?
That's
You're
right.
guaranteed failure. If you don't try, congratulations, you are guaranteed to fail. Well, I mean, again in the research, we asked people around speaking up in meetings, and we found that 77% of people don't always speak up in meetings because they doubt themselves.
Mm,
I
wow.
just think, oh my goodness, that's so many people who are holding back something which might be brilliant.
Absolutely. Yeah. And critical.
Such a shame.
Yeah, because I think about it in multiple directions, right? On the innovation front, it could be an idea that no one's thought of. But on the risk
Mm,
management front, it could be I'm not speaking up and saying, uh-oh, we really should think about this
yeah.
a little bit better because we're going to face this consequence. If we don't, we're thinking to ourselves, oh, if this were a good idea, someone else would have come up with it already, right?
Yeah, yeah. Well, I mean, coming from my banking world, which obviously is a very regulatory driven world, I think this is one of the things which in some ways people have missed. I mean, there's a neurodiversity piece of having, multiple different people around the table and their brains around the table. But even if you reach utopia in terms of that, if you don't create an environment where people feel safe enough to then speak up, then and creating the speak up culture, the danger is exactly to your point. There's the next Nick Leeson, like a rogue trader, someone who isn't doing the right thing. Maybe management are going a little bit, there's some interesting investment decisions which are being made or things which are being overlooked, which actually you or people around the table say, you know what, no, this isn't the right thing to do. And so if you as an organization, you don't create an environment which is psychologically safe, whatever your numbers are, then you're not going to get that diversity of thought. And from a risk perspective, you'll get a lot more risk too.
Yes. So you're just reinforcing the fact that this is not an individual problem either, right? I think there's a certain amount that
Mm,
we personally have control over and that we can do to invest in ourselves. But this is really a collective challenge that we need.
mm,
And I think the fact that you're talking about it at a macro organizational level is so important.
mm. Yeah, and I mean, from having experienced it a lot myself, I really feel that, like from an individual perspective, the stress of being terrified when you're going to work or sitting in a meeting and thinking, oh, please don't ask me a question. That it can be you can get such terrible anxiety from it. Um, and yeah, then organizations, they need to understand there's a ripple effect of that. But from an individual point of view, really, if you allow it to take over, there's you can end up with that rumination piece, and that's when your self-worth is really plummeting, and so there's lots of different ways that we can kind of try and stop that and control that. But it's something which is beyond that one item. It can just ripple out into your life in so many different ways.
Hmm. And you have a book coming out on this, right?
I do, yes,
Tell us.
yes. So the book is called Confident, and it's how to be confident using the secrets and superpowers of neuroscience. And it's all about all of these things: imposter syndrome, looking at your critic. We dive into menopause, redundancy, motherhood. Some really fundamental things that I mean, it's there's the book can be for men too. We really dive into that from a female perspective. I really wanted to focus on that. It's a real passion of mine. And we have lots of different tools and techniques that you can use And the other thing was I really wanted to make it real. So I've interviewed 13 different people from all different walks of life. There are some celebrities in there, some kind of just extraordinary people in their kind of ordinary lives. And, we look at, okay, well, what is confidence? What is confidence for you? What are the experiences? We've got a fighter pilot in there, someone who was captain of an international football team, rugby team, the first Black woman on the PGA Tour in the UK. So people who've had real challenges in terms of their journeys and the lessons and amazing things that they've learned on those, how to overcome their issues with confidence.
I can't wait to read it. I am super excited, and I could talk to you all day. This is such a fascinating topic, and there's so much to it. So I really want to encourage anybody who's interested to get your book. Where else can they find you if they're interested in following you and your work?
So I am at Brain Powered Coaching on all of the platforms. You can find me Instagram, Facebook. LinkedIn is Caroline Brewin. So I think I'm the only one on there, so you can find me on there. And yeah, so I'm pretty active on that. You can find all sorts of videos, and our website is Brain Powered Coaching, and on there you'll find lots of freebies and links to the book as well.
Excellent. Well, the links will be in the show notes for anyone listening. And thank you so much, Caroline. Thank you for being here, and thank you for all the great work you're doing.
Yeah, my pleasure. Thank you, Kim.
Thanks so much for listening to the Impostor Syndrome Files. If you would like to continue this conversation in a safe and trusted space, I would love for you to join my virtual discussion group every Thursday at 12 p.m. Eastern. For the past several years, the group has been limited to women, but it is now open, regardless of gender, to anyone who is interested in exploring and troubleshooting common workplace challenges, building better awareness of ourselves and others, and becoming more inclusive allies at work. Check out the show notes for more info on how to find us, and please join us next week for another episode of the Impostor Syndrome Files.